While South Korea and Japan have yet to resolve the ongoing dispute, the expiry date for GSOMIA is approaching near. Seoul and Tokyo have been exchanging sensitive military information after signing GSOMIA in 2016. But as the bilateral relations have deepened over Japan's export curbs, Seoul had announced in August it would not renew the military intel sharing pact with Tokyo. The two sides had 3 months to discuss the renewal until it expires on November 23rd, but there hasn't been any progress thus far. Amid the heightened tension, South Korean Prime Minister Lee Nak-yeon delivered a personal letter written by President Moon Jae-in to Japanese Prime Minister Abe while attending Emperor Naruhito's enthronement ceremony on October 24th. Korea was waiting for Japan's official response. But on November 4th, the leaders of the two nations have finally sat down for talks on the sidelines of the ASEAN summit in Bangkok. Through the meeting, the two leaders have agreed to hold dialogue to mend the long-running dispute.
Hello, welcome to The Point. I'm your host, Daniel Che. GSOMIA will be no more come late November. Seoul decided to terminate the intel sharing pact with Tokyo after Japan imposed retaliatory trade measures, citing security concerns. So unless there's some drastic improvement in frosty bilateral ties, it seems unlikely South Korea will reverse that decision. This is a topic for today. We'll be joined by a panel of experts from inside and outside of the nation for in-depth discussions. So, let's get to the point. To dissect today's topic into digestible bites, we're joined by John Park, professor of law from Handong University. Thank you so much for making time for us today.
Good to be here, Daniel. Thank you.
First of all, our topic of today is, of course, GSOMIA, the intel sharing pact between South Korea and Japan. And starting midnight, November 23rd, it will no longer be in effect. Does Korea have any intention to renew this pact at all?
Well, at this point, it's not impossible to renew, but the forces behind the geopolitical forces right now at play seems really difficult for Korea to reverse its decision, particularly for the Moon administration. We have a conflation of three big issues that surrounds GSOMIA. And of course, there's pretext to that, which is the historical issue involving the forced labor. We have, on top of that, the trade issue that has been brought upon because of that, and now a national security issue, which is GSOMIA. And so with those three big issues on the table, the Korean Moon administration, of course, will continue to feel a lot of pressure until the clock runs out in the next couple of weeks. But it's hard to say what the clear position of the government is because it's really developing as we speak.
Right, and early this month, Japan's Defense Chief Taro Kono said he wishes South Korea makes a wise decision. How would you read between the lines on this statement?
Well, I think that can be taken as a passive threat or a benign comment. Defense Minister Kono, formerly the foreign minister of Japan for 2 years, things he says does carry weight because he is known to be a very high-profile figure in Japan politics. He may be even in line to be the next prime minister. So things he says, of course, carries a lot of weight, but it's hard to say. What is clear is that he's made in no uncertain terms in previous press releases or other dialogue that Korea should clearly renew GSOMIA, that this is a great mistake that Korea is committing. And so something about along the lines of making a wise decision. Of course, the implication is that Korea should stay the course and renew GSOMIA when the time comes.
We've seen the leaders of South Korea and Japan awkwardly posing for photos in international conferences in the past, but this time at the ASEAN Plus 3 summit, they've actually sat down for talks for a whole 11 minutes, apparently. Does this give some hope that this could be something that could ignite dialogue between the two sides?
Yes, I think so. It's a positive development. The fact that this is the first face-to-face conversation between President Moon and Abe, I think it's been about 14 months since the last time they met. That's significant. The last time they met at the G20 in Osaka, it was just a handshake and meetings for some pictures. But to have some conversation here, following up on Prime Minister Lee Nak-yeon's visit to Japan just last month, delivering the letter written by President Moon, I think this is the next step where they felt like they could engage, albeit brief, some conversation that looks to be relatively positive.
It's time for us to now look into how the U.S. feels about the GSOMIA issue. We have Greg Andrew Brzezinski, professor at George Washington University, joining us via Skype. Thank you for making time for us.
Thank you for having me.
Well, the Intel sharing pact will terminate on November 23rd. How does Washington view Seoul's decision?
So I think in general, the policy establishment in Washington is relatively pro-Japan and sympathetic towards Japan. And that's been something of a problem for South Korea in terms of the way that the GSOMIA cancellation is being seen. I obviously don't share the view of the majority of the policy establishment on this issue, but I think in general, I've heard more criticism of South Korea than I've heard criticism of Japan. I don't think it's fair. I don't think that these views are fully informed. But in Washington, I've heard more people being relatively sympathetic to Japan on the GSOMIA issue.
Right now, it seems like South Korea and Japan are having a tough time resolving bilateral issues. Is there any chance of America stepping up as a mediator?
I think it will be pretty difficult for the Trump administration to mediate the conflict. That's one problem. I think one issue with Trump is that he's not very interested in sustaining America's alliances and in defending and protecting the national security architecture in the Pacific that Trump's predecessors did so much to build up. I do think that if we wait until 2020, there is a reasonably good chance that President Trump will not be reelected. I would say the chances of the next Democratic candidate for beating him, the chances that the next Democratic candidate will beat him are probably way above 50%. So I think that if Trump loses, then you may have a new president in office in early 2021, and hopefully the new president will put will take more of an interest in trying to restore relations between Japan and South Korea.
Professor Brzezinski, Seoul's decision to terminate GSOMIA is made due to deteriorating bilateral relations, mainly caused by Tokyo's trade measures and unwillingness to compensate wartime forced labor victims. Prime Minister Abe previously raised doubts over South Korea's security even. Did Japan put the inter-sharing pact in jeopardy in the first place?
I think yes, absolutely. It is it is more Japan's fault that GSOMIA is collapsing, or that GSOMIA has been terminated or will be terminated, than it is South Korea's. There's a few reasons why I think Japan is more responsible for this. First of all, when it comes to the historical issues, Japan has repeatedly failed to show sufficient contrition. And I think when you talk about the ill will between Japan and South Korea, where does it come from? A lot of it comes from the way that Japan handles the historical issues. But it also, though, I think it's important to note that these historical issues have existed for a long time. These disputes have existed for a long time. I think it was really Japan and Shinzo Abe's government that took these historical issues and decided to do serious damage to the bilateral relationship between Tokyo and Seoul over them. It was Tokyo that first started taking economic measures against South Korea, that started to Shinzo Abe's removing the South Korea from its whitelist. And I think that it was really that move by Tokyo that is what turned these sort of long-standing historical disputes, which were bad and which were difficult to resolve, but nonetheless had never really affected the bilateral economic relationship and had never really affected bilateral military and security relations between Japan and South Korea, and turned it into an issue that had a more serious and significant impact on the bilateral relationship.
Professor Greg Brzezinski, thank you so much for your insights and time. We appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
Korea and Japan got entangled into the prolonging dispute following an incident that happened a year ago. Here's a clip showing how the bilateral relations started to deteriorate.
Uncertainty lingers for South Korea-Japan relations, which has been triggered by Tokyo's export curbs. Only a few days remain before GSOMIA goes out of effect, but the two sides haven't decided whether to renew the military agreement. Seoul and Tokyo also haven't narrowed their differences in the forced labor ruling. On October 30th last year, the South Korean Supreme Court ruled that Japanese firms should compensate the victims of Japan's wartime forced labor. The Japanese firms have rebuffed the ruling. To retaliate the South Korean court's ruling, Tokyo has placed export curbs on some key chip items on Seoul on July 1st. Later, on August 7th, it also scrapped South Korea off its list of trusted trading partners. The South Korean government downgraded Japan from its whitelist and filed a complaint at the WTO over Tokyo's export curbs. But as Tokyo chose to remain silent and unwilling to mend the frayed ties, Seoul had no choice but not extend GSOMIA. It's been more than a year since the South Korean Supreme Court's ruling on the forced labor issue has been made, but Japan is still refusing to abide by it and compensate the victims. Since the ruling has been made, more than 30 cases related to the forced labor issue are waiting to be looked into by the Supreme Court. On October 30th, South Korean victims of the wartime forced labor have filed an appeal with the UN Human Rights Council. The seemingly disconnected relations between the two countries have recently found a chance to open up a dialogue. On October 24th, South Korean Prime Minister Lee Nak-yeon delivered President Moon's letter to Japanese Prime Minister Abe on his way to attend Emperor Naruhito's enthronement ceremony. 11 days after the coronation, the leaders of South Korea and Japan have met on the sidelines of the ASEAN summit in Bangkok. The two leaders have agreed to find ways to resolve the frayed ties. It could open up new opportunities for the two nations to thaw the long-running dispute.
One of the major causes of the ongoing dispute between the two sides is, of course, the wartime forced labor issue, mainly Japan's inability to acknowledge it and wanting to bury it in the past. Last October, Seoul's top court ruled Japanese firms must pay for victims 100 million won each. So far, no compensations.
That's correct. No compensations have been made thus far, primarily because of the Abe administration has spoken very strongly against the decision, triggering a series of moves by both countries to escalate the tension to bring us where we are today. The compensation, there are still a series of decisions that are pending, but most recently in Daegu, in the Daegu District Court, as well as in Daejeon, there were decisions by the court to try to enforce, essentially enforce the decisions that have been made by the Supreme Court. And so those cases will be making its through the system. So we'll just have to wait and see how they carry out, how they are carried out ultimately.
With Japan unwilling to compensate, the victims have filed an appeal with the UN Human Rights Council as well. Could this move further pressure Japan?
I think so. There's other moves like comparatively where Korea filed with a complaint with the WTO to make that the issue of the export curbs Japan instituted pursuant to this case. I think the victims filing this could also put additional pressure to essentially bring in outsiders for objective opinion, neutral opinion about the same issue, and have some clarity, as opposed to two parties just going back and forth, reaching no further than a stalemate so far.
And if Japan continues to resist, what further steps could South Korea take? It seems like some of the viable options would be, unfortunately for the Japanese firms, would require possibly selling their assets in Korea further.
Yeah, I think the fact that this is a Korean National Court decision and that there's teeth in the decisions in a national court, and so the court could further order these companies to pay and begin to maybe freeze assets, asset forfeiture, or take away other privileges by the company to do business. And so there is that possibility that the Korean courts will take those measures, and if the companies don't comply, hold them in contempt of court. And so it could further escalate the proceedings. We're hoping that none of that happens, that some of the diplomatic channels of discussion that is being held at the highest levels would resolve all three of these issues somehow in the next few months. But it really seems very difficult because this is not an issue that just came up overnight. This is an ongoing issue that's been in the decades in the making. And it just so happens that with the current Korean administration and the Korean domestic politics and national politics in Japan, that those things have really escalated and built up the tension even to a far higher degree than anyone had imagined.
All right, let us extend this conversation further out of South Korea again. And now let's extend our discussions to an expert in Japan on how Tokyo wants to handle the compensation issue. We have Jeffrey Kingston, professor of Asia Studies at Temple University's Japan campus, joining us via Skype. Good to have you with us, Professor.
Thanks for having me. Hello.
Hello, thank you for being here with us. The South Korean Supreme Court has concluded victims of Japan's wartime forced labor have the right to seek compensation. What is Tokyo's reaction to the court ruling?
Well, the Japanese government disagrees with the Supreme Court ruling. Their view is that the 1965 Basic Treaty of Normalization resolved all issues related to the colonial era. So in Tokyo, their view is that the South Korean government, since 1965, has recognized that the forced labor compensation issue has been resolved. And in 2005, President Roh looked into the matter. They set up a commission, and it took about 10 years. And part of what the commission found is that the Japanese government had provided money to be distributed among the forced laborers, and Seoul had not really distributed very much of that money to the forced laborers. Instead, used the money to promote heavy industrialization and the economic miracle on the Han.
Professor Kingston, Japanese firms have apologized to Chinese victims and provided compensation. Why can't they do the same to Korean victims? Why is there this double standard?
Yes, it is rather puzzling. There does seem to be a double standard. A number of Japanese companies have settled with Chinese plaintiffs, and they have made elaborate apologies, and they provided compensation. So if you're a South Korean, you're wondering why the Chinese get treated so well, and why is Japan stiff-arming South Korea? Again, it goes back to Japan's view is Korea was part of the Japanese Empire. Koreans were Japanese subjects. The 1938 National Mobilization Law allowed for the Japanese to legally conscript Koreans into work, and about 800,000 of them came to Japan. Whereas the case in China, legally, it's a little more shaky ground. There was a 1942 cabinet decision that authorized recruitment of labor in China. Clearly, it happened on extremely coercive conditions, and the laborers were very badly treated. But the Korean laborers were also generally badly treated. So again, it comes down to Japan believes that legally their position vis-a-vis the Korean plaintiffs is stronger. But the Supreme Court ruling says that the settlement could not waive individual rights to compensation. And this means that they're saying is the annexation, original annexation, was illegal. And so there's no basis for Japan to claim that the 38 law actually absolves them of legal responsibility. And in addition, the Supreme Court in Korea decided that human rights were violated. And so there is a case to be made that the human rights violations also generated a cause for compensation. So I think that clearly this is a case that is not going to be decided in the courts. It's a very political case. Why would Japanese companies decide to settle in one country and not the other? Because in 2007, the Supreme Court in Japan basically said Japanese companies are protected from any and all claims, right? So the Japanese companies knew that if they went to court, they'd win. So why would they settle if, in a sense, if they fought the case in court, they couldn't lose? And I think it has a lot to do with not wanting to be in a Chinese court and the possibility of being penalized in the Chinese market. And given Chinese economic clout, problems were gathering in the Senkaku. I think that since 2014, there's been sort of improvement or thaw in Sino-Japanese relations. So I think that the settlement a couple of years ago that they finalized between Mitsubishi with materials, which used to be Mitsubishi Mining, probably took cognizance of the broader geopolitical situation. Whereas the case in Korea, I mean, it's complicated. The Japanese government feels that the Koreans weaponize history. And I think in particular, the current government is run by Prime Minister Abe, who is a revisionist who wants to rehabilitate Japan's wartime and colonial history. So he's not particularly inclined to make concessions on history.
And so suggested a 1+1 proposal, Korean and Japanese firms voluntarily creating a fund to compensate the victims. But Tokyo rebuffed the offer. How does Japan want to handle the compensation issue then?
I think it wants to continue to claim that all claims have been resolved in 1965, and that is it. They are protecting their legal position, but there is a case to be made for assuming moral responsibility. And in the case of China, there was joint funds set up, and this has, allocated money to memorializing the victims of forced labor and looking for former victims and compensating them. So there is a precedent in China. But when this possibility was leaked to the press earlier this week, there was a quick denial by Abe's chief cabinet spokesman, said, no, there is no such proposal. We're not considering doing this. So it does seem too soon to imagine that that fund is going to come into being. I think that it probably would be a sensible proposal, but President Moon has already suggested this in June, and Abe rejected it out of hand. So I don't think things have changed that dramatically in terms of the thinking in Tokyo that they're going to choose to take up this opportunity to try to dial down the pressure and to resolve historical grievances. But who knows?
All right, thank you so much, Professor Jeffrey Kingston, for your time and your expertise. We appreciate it.
Thank you for having me on the show.
Now, coming back to you, Professor Park, it looks like there is a clear double standard when it comes to Japan perceiving the relations with China and Korea. How do you anticipate the relationship unfolding from here on, also as an experienced legal professional yourself?
I think there's still some legal maneuvering that both countries can engage in, but we're really reaching the bottom or the top of the escalating tensions that have been spiraling out, what seems like out of control. From Japanese standpoint, they really want to hold Korea to the letter of the law. And they may have some good arguments, but Korea has equally valid arguments against the 1965 agreement and other cases in the courts. But I think what the Korean people seem to want is a genuine, the Korean word 정 comes to mind, where Koreans are full of passion and affections. And if there's a genuine heartfelt apology or even a shed tear, as Professor mentioned, sort of the moral aspect, I think that would go a long way, as opposed to what they feel like is just a very cold, surface level apologies that just hasn't been enough. And I think until that atmosphere is resolved in a much more favorable way, I think it's hard to engage in some really honest discussion. So I think breakdown of trust really needs to be higher than the breakdown or than holding on to your pride for both countries to favorably resolve these big issues facing both of them.
One of my favorite professors in college used to say, it's not what you do or say, but how. So I guess this applies to the situation between South Korea and Japan, and we are seeing some efforts by South Korea to try and reach out and hold conversations and address this issue.
Yes, I would agree. I think just the fact that the both heads have met recently, let's look forward to some more opportunities, and they agree. I think that this is almost rock bottom in the Japan-Korea relations, and I think both parties would do well to engage in further discussions and build off of this recent positive development just the other day.
All right, as much as we would like to pick your brain further, we'll have to let you go. Professor Park, we appreciate you coming in and making our program complete today.
Thank you. Great to be here again.
Starting from historical disputes, bilateral relations in various levels, including trade and security, continue to deteriorate between the two sides. To prevent further escalation that can more adversely affect the citizens of both countries, the governments of South Korea and Japan must negotiate, not argue, sooner than later, no matter how tough, to reach a fair resolution. That's all we have for you at this hour. Do join us again same time next week for a brand new episode of The Point. Thank you for watching.